It's May the 25th, 1983. The final part of the Star Wars original trilogy, Return of the Jedi, has just been released in the United States and Canada, with audiences waiting overnight. The film would make a profit within 5 weeks, and coupled with the addition of commercial licenses, the potential backstories of the likes of Obi-Wan and Darth Vader, which had been teased by George Lucas, seemed a formality. But for all the apparent success, this was the lowest point of the life of Lucas, and his previous 6 years of work that he had put into Star Wars was placed on the shelf, where it remained for over a decade. This is the story of everything that happened between the end of Return of the Jedi and the start of The Phantom Menace. This is the 16-year itch that never went away. The 1952 play and late adaptation of The 7-Year Itch is a story of a relationship that deteriorated over time, and this was the effect that the making of the original Star Wars trilogy had on George and Marcia Lucas. Throughout the trilogy, Marcia was heavily influential in writing and editing, and in particular, the emotion of the characters portrayed on screen. But starting in Empire Strikes Back, George's devotion to Star Wars was making him cold. As she would describe at the end of their marriage, George had become an emotional wall and a workaholic, and this showed throughout Return of the Jedi, with constant arguments that even extended to other crew members, such as Dwayne Dunham and Howard Kazanjan. The frustrations of George would be seen in the film itself, such as Boba Fett being dumped into the Sarlacc pit, in reflection of his frustration, and despite promises of raising their child, his decision to make another Indiana Jones film was the final straw for Marcia. So when Return of the Jedi was released, what should have been a celebration of success had just become the worst time of his life, and with the exception of Indiana Jones, George Lucas was done with making films. As Lucas entered what he described as a multi-year tailspin, the franchise he had left abandoned was able to survive, with the sale of action figures and the production of spin-offs. Shortly after the release of Return of the Jedi were 2 films based on the Ewoks, with the first called A Caravan of Courage released in 1984, and The Battle of Endor which followed 2 years later, and they aimed to redeem themselves after the holiday special by drawing a younger audience. This was followed by an animation series known as Droids, based around the adventures of R2-D2 and C-3PO, and it created an arcade-style game and other merchandise, but it was clear that the franchise was becoming a memory of the past. Lucas had turned into a background figure within Star Wars, as he was quietly observing the making of Indiana Jones, but he helped design an attraction at Disneyland California called Star Tours, which was a military-grade simulator with visual sequences of TIE fighters and a space battle around the Death Star, all the while being asked about a potential Star Wars prequel trilogy. Whilst he had no intentions of making one in 1987, the vision he had then was similar to what actually happened, with Obi-Wan training Anakin, Palpatine being a two-faced politician who turns Anakin to the dark side, a duel between Obi-Wan and Anakin on a volcano, and finally Luke and Leia being split up to protect them from the Jedi hunting Sith. Despite these ideas, the reality for Lucas was that he was still struggling, especially from his divorce settlement several years earlier, so he couldn't fund a new Star Wars film that met his lofty expectations, and the franchise itself had turned into a political statement that tarnished its reputation. Even before the release of Return of the Jedi, the United States President at the time, Ronald Reagan, had proposed a defense system called the Strategic Defense Initiative, aimed at intercepting an array of missiles. With battle stations on both Earth and in space, opposing senators and the media were called the Initiative Star Wars, and Lucas hated the connection, so he tried and failed to win a court case, adding to his pile of misery and financial troubles. Lucas thankfully had his visual effects company, Industrial Light and Magic, in reserve, and during his hiatus, the company worked on movies such as Back to the Future to help cover the costs for some of his losses. This was also the time when the annual Star Wars convention was founded, and Lucas would be asked about the prequels again, and this time he deflected the questions, rather than denying them, with answers ranging from a lack of energy to other interests such as his private life. But the introduction of the convention and the Star Wars role-playing game by West End Games, with sourcebooks and supplements, couldn't hide the fact that Star Wars was still in decline, with audiences looking for alternatives, such as the controversial ill-fated Masters of the Universe. After the release of the last printings of Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the Han Solo Adventures, and a set of Lando Calrissian books, the official Star Wars fan club was deactivated by Lucas himself, and the original trilogy had turned into a classic set of films. Splinter of the Mind's Eye, incidentally, was actually written alongside A New Hope, with the aim of creating a low-budget sequel film, but as the Star Wars franchise grew, he abandoned the low-budget idea. As the first novel in the expanded universe, the author Alan Dean Foster was somewhat limited, as he couldn't use the likes of Han Solo or Chewbacca, nor could he mention Darth Vader being Luke's father, so that Lucas ensured he had options for Empire Strikes Back. Likewise with the first of the Han Solo books, known as At Star's End, events were restricted to before the original trilogy, with Harrison Ford's continuation in the films still a matter of dispute, but when Lucas started to retreat into the background of Star Wars, so did these books. At the end of the 1980s, Lucas still considered Star Wars as a project for the future, whilst he worked on Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, then the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, and it was during these productions that he inadvertently set the foundations for the Star Wars prequel trilogy. The declining health of his parents and the raising of his children had been the biggest priorities since the end of Return of the Jedi, and he would also start the George Lucas Educational Foundation, which aimed to innovate learning through the use of technology, and with the Indiana Jones Chronicles, it inspired an innovative type of filmmaking. At the reignited Skywalker Ranch, Lucas introduced software called EditDroid, which was a non-linear computer editor that streamlined the finding of discarded clips and tripled the speed of an average film edit, and he stored any footage in video discs. This was combined with a digital audio tool called SoundDroid and visual effects made from digitalized backgrounds and composites, something he would develop for the prequel trilogy. Both EditDroid and SoundDroid were not without their faults, with continuous bugs and glitches since his birth in 1980, but after these projects were sold, Lucas would continue to tinker with this revolutionary technology, and it reignited some of his passion for filmmaking. He began to wonder if he could apply some of his new techniques to resurrect the Star Wars franchise, as using digital sets would be much cheaper and allow creations on a greater scale. But for now, these innovations could not save Young Indiana Jones Chronicles from only lasting 2 seasons, as Lucas and the ABC network failed to see eye to eye, and even Harrison Ford appearing in the second season couldn't prevent the low ratings. Nevertheless, not only did the show win multiple Emmy Awards for visual effects and sound composition, but for the first time in almost a decade, Lucas was enjoying his filmmaking and described it as his happiest and most engaging project. At the same time, the Star Wars franchise was showing signs of revival thanks to the Dark Horse comic series Dark Empire, game releases on the Nintendo Game Boy with trading cards and figures, but most significantly, the Heir to the Empire novels. The birth of this trilogy could be considered an accident, and beginning in 1988, the author Lou Aronica, who worked for Bantam Books, would ask Lucas for permission to publish stories based on events after Return of the Jedi. At that time, Lucas had resigned from Star Wars, so he thought any novels would fail to sell, and he allowed Timothy Zahn to begin writing. The only constraints were that the novels were set after Return of the Jedi to leave room for the prequel trilogy, and he couldn't use any characters who had been killed off in the films, so this prevented Jorah Sabath becoming a clone of Obi-Wan. When the book was released on June 4th, 1991, the expectations of failure from Lucas were destroyed when the book sold 60,000 copies in its first week and Star Wars had risen from the ashes. The success of the Heir to the Empire books was a shock to both Lucas and Lucasfilm. Zahn's focus on some of the less detailed aspects of the original trilogy, such as politics, and the introduction of characters such as Mara Jade, had helped to draw the adult audience. The Dark Horse Dark Empire comics reinforced the comeback of Star Wars, and placed ahead of the events in the Zahn trilogy. It had similar enough success to provide 2 sequels, so Lucas could not ignore Star Wars for any longer. The final push for the franchise to return proved to actually be his work on Jurassic Park, and the advancements made in computer graphics spawned a revolution. Combined with some recent monetary success, he considered the opportunity of another trilogy as too good to miss, and the announcement was made in late 1993. The near 6-year gap to the eventual release of The Phantom Menace would be filled by both Star Wars and tests from Lucas. The publishers of the Heir to the Empire trilogy, Bantam Books, leapt onto the wave of success and released the Jedi Prince series, the Corellian trilogy which helped to explore Han Solo, and the Jedi Academy trilogy which brought Luke and his new Jedi Order. The most significant novel was Shadows of the Empire, which was part of a bigger project, almost intentionally created by Lucas during the original trilogy to fill any gaps in the plot. The novel was combined with a Nintendo 64 game, Dark Horse Comics, and other merchandise such as trading cards, and it is one of the first examples of cross-media storytelling, a method that is now strongly applied by Marvel. This project also gave a greater insight into Darth Vader, just before we see what he was like as Anakin Skywalker, and it was part of the idea that to return to Star Wars, its creators would have to explore every angle of every market. At the same time, Lucas was not sitting still. With the revolution of Jurassic Park, he continued to experiment with this new digital technology, and in a 1994 film called Radioland Murders, he dispensed with the old-fashioned pre-war sets and lowered his budget to $50 million. Whilst the film was a commercial failure and voted as one of the worst films of the year, Lucas thought otherwise because he had now proved he could create entire sets only using his computer, and he would soon begin writing the Star Wars prequel trilogy. Rather than writing one film at a time, Lucas decided he would try to write all three at once within a year, and follow it with a year of preparation, then a year of shooting the films. This allowed him to map out a story arc, rather than patching plot holes as he went along, and with an ending already defined by A New Hope, writing should have been easier than the original trilogy. The problem was that the notes he had written for the prequel trilogy, which were written before Return of the Jedi, had little in the way of storyline, but only details such as background and locations. He had a particular obsession with Mos Eisley, because in Return of the Jedi, the Jabba the Hutt sequence took 4 months, and Lucas still had regrets about the lack of a crowd, as well as how Jabba was portrayed. Having been somewhat criticised for his lack of imagination in Return of the Jedi, his imagination was not found wanting for The Phantom Menace. With inspiration from post-First World War architecture, Lucas combined Star Wars and historical events to portray a hidden darkness beneath the buildings. After 10 weeks, Lucas would have his first draft in early 1995, and with the combined efforts of Rick McCallum and Frank Darabont, they had created something which could change perceptions of the original trilogy. In the draft known as The Beginning, the focus with the films was still on Anakin Skywalker, and whilst Lucas liked Obi-Wan, his failure would be a part of Anakin's demons. The struggle to align the plot with the original trilogy was also a problem when it came to creating the rise of Palpatine, so instead of turning him into an obviously corrupt politician, Lucas decided to make him more subtle, and so the Sith were born. The reference of the Clone Wars, which was made by Obi-Wan in A New Hope, had yet to be seriously expanded, even in the books or comics, and Lucas found it difficult to ensure every event was somehow connected to Palpatine's manipulations. Alongside the Sith, Lucas had to change the Jedi from mystical characters, like Obi-Wan perceived in A New Hope, to a religious group with a strict code. This enabled the hubris of the Jedi to occur from their overconfidence, and it gave Obi-Wan a flaw to pass to Anakin. Such was the complexity of these characters, and the necessity to create new material. Lucas hadn't even finished the script before he asked his art department to employ some of his digital innovations. These innovations would first be used in special editions of the original trilogy, such was Lucas's disgust when he looked at these films, and their success proved to Lucas that a digital Star Wars would have hype in the cinemas. In 1996, the casting for The Phantom Menace would begin, and whilst he previously didn't like known actors, he decided to make exceptions. The likes of Samuel L. Jackson and Liam Neeson were brought in, and even Michael Jackson was considered for the role of Jar Jar Binks. But what didn't change was how Lucas handled the actors. Lucas was not someone who gave detailed instructions to actors, and coupled with the new technology, he worked together with the actors to find out the best ways to use blue screens. Thanks to some of his team on Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, some of the weight was taken off of Lucas, as he embarked on a mission to tie toy companies to the Star Wars franchise. Lucas also made sure that Fox reprised their role as distributors, whilst maintaining his own control over both the prequels and the original trilogy, and by late 1998, the trailer was finally released. If Lucas needed any confirmation that Star Wars was truly back, the trailer broke the internet with 10 million downloads, and all toy stores were bombarded with fans. When the film was released on May 19, 1999, it unsurprisingly became a commercial sensation, but many Star Wars fans were left disappointed. Characters such as Jar Jar Binks were not received as Lucas had wanted, and explanations of the biology of the Force were considered sacrilegious. Nevertheless, Lucas had concluded what had been a 16-year journey from a personal fall to a return to glory. That is it for this Star Wars documentary. Let me know if you like these longer videos, and feel free to leave any suggestions for any topics I can cover. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.